Well, hello, welcome to the video. This one's about yet another 5 great bands from the 1980s that should have been huge but maybe vanished without trace. My credentials are I was involved with the music business, especially in London, since the early 1970s, so I do know what I'm talking about. So stick around and maybe you could find your new favourite band. Who knows? Well, let's get started straight away. The first band we're going to talk about is Dislocation Dance from Manchester, who were not the normal indie band of the time. They formed in 1978, quite early after punk. They combined jazz, funk, soul, all kinds of things with indie punk. They were very successful. I put them on in late 1980s in London at the Cricketers. They were on a bit of a revival then because they had their main success before then. I thought they were very interesting and very exciting. Their big claim to fame was, well, maybe this is their fatal flaw that they turned down factory records. Who knows? But they did sign to the Buzzcocks record label and they had some slight success but never quite made it. Their potential was never really achieved.
Reach for the clouds. Come on, achieve your potential.
The next band we're talking about is the Larks.
She put her arms around me and she said with a smile, She said she's alone and nothing got her.
Very rarely do you get a band who have a big live following. I mean, towards the end of their brief life, the Larks headlined at the Town and Country Club. It may have been called the Forum then, who knows, which is a big place to play. I put them on several times at the Cricketers. I really liked them. They were, I don't know, they had horns, they were punky, they had horns, they were political.
Maggie! Oh!
They hated playing at the Sir George Roby, by this time called the Roby. I remember saying to me, we're never going to play there again. And Malcolm and I talked about this afterwards, and he told me that every time they actually said that, he just rang up the agent and offered them I think 50 quid or 100 quid, and they changed their minds and played again. But then they said, this is the last time, this is a one-off, we're not going to do it again. But he did this about 4 or 5 times, so who knows? They were better live than on record. They never really translated their energy to the records. They started off in Canterbury at some university. One of their members went off to play in Jules Holland's big band, and I think he's still playing with them now, which is 40 years later or something, because they're very exciting on stage, I say, very youthful. Their energy shone forth, and I think now maybe they're a bit older, sitting at home going, oh well, maybe we should have done another year or two. I'm going to say it again, who knows? At this point, can I just say, if you like this video, please like it, subscribe, etc. and share it with your friends. Let's get back to the music, shall we?
Cue the music again.
And the next one we're going to talk about is... the Potato Five. Now, the Potato Five were a strange band. Again, I put them on at the Cricketers when I was at the Cricketers at the Oval. By the way, I ought to explain that the Cricketers is a pub I used to do. I used to do lots of venues back in those days. I've done 20 venues in London between 1973 and 2019 when I effectively stopped, when the Borderline closed. And the Cricketers was the one I was at longest. I was based there, I lived there, and that was my finest hour, I think, because we put on a wide selection of bands. It was just the right time in the 1980s, which is what we're talking about here. That sort of period in British music was one of the most exciting periods. It was like there were so many fantastic bands. That was a problem. If you were in a band back then, there were probably, I don't know, it must have been very disheartening. You must have had to have a very strong drive to continue back then, because as I say, there were maybe thousands of great bands on the circuit. I mean, in London alone, I think I mentioned this in previous videos, we used to get tapes in every week, and we literally got hundreds every week. Most of them were, I'd say, needed a bit of work, shall we say. But out of every week's posts, you'd get maybe 20 really good tapes. And then obviously you get the agents who are representing acts who are higher up the chain than that. And then they'd want to bring their own support act with them. So you'd have very little opportunity to put on acts. But when I was at the Cricketers, one of the bands I did put on quite a lot with the Potato Five. They started off, I think they were civil servants or something like that. They were, without being rude, the guys in the band seem very nerdy. Well, the two guys, I think, who formed the band, and they started off as an instrumental ska band. I suppose that they were trying to do what the Scatolites, the two guys who started it, weren't Jamaican. They were from South London, as far as I can recall. Maybe totally wrong, maybe North London, maybe East London, whatever. I actually think East London. I think Hackney rings a bell now. So they started this ska band, and they were playing instrumentals, and then I believe what happened was a guy called Floyd Lloyd, who was like, actually Jamaican, I believe, and he was a musician, but he was doing more hippie stuff. He was doing Van Morrison style covers, but he'd been brought up in this reggae ska background in a Jamaican family, so he knew all about it. And he saw them at a show in Victoria Park, I think it was, in East London, which is where they used to put a lot of GLC things on there. And he was playing there, and he saw them, and he offered his services as their lead singer. Said that they needed somebody to do in vocals, which I think they probably did, because I'm not sure I booked them when they were just an instrumental band. And so he joined them, and he became a very strident frontman. And so they were billed as Floyd Lloyd and the Potato Five, and that was the band I mainly put on at the Cricketers. They were very good value. They played mostly over London. Gaz Mayall of Gaz's Rockin' Blues, who was John Mayall's son, who was basically, he had his own band called the Trojans, which was like a ska band, and he signed the Potato Five to his record label. I think he formed it for himself, really, but they were the first act who were on Gaz Mayall's record label, which I think was called Gaz's Rockin' Blues, and he got a deal with Stiff where he licensed it to Stiff, where they basically manufactured it and marketed it. So I put them on a few times, and then what happened was apparently they were playing at Dingwall's. There's a guy called Laurel Aitken. I think he was actually Cuban, but he was brought up in Jamaica with a Jamaican family, and he was quite a well-known ska person, and he, for some reason, ended up living in Leicester. Don't forget, back then, there was the two-tone thing happened in the late 1970s up to the early 80s, which produced, obviously, the Specials and the Selector and the Madness. But after that, really, the ska thing died down a bit. And so this was a bit of an outlier. And the Potato Five were, I mean, when I was doing shows at the Cricketers, there were, say, quite a few ska bands, but because I was quite into the ska thing, and it was quite popular with the audience that came to the Cricketers. There was the Forest Hill Billies, there was the Potato Five, obviously, there were the Deltones, which were like a female band. You know, there were places they did do that well. So South London was their stomping ground. So the Potato Five were playing at Dingwall's, and Laurel Aitken saw them, and he offered his services.
Hit time! Hit time! Hit time! Hit time!
Now, this was obviously pretty much the end, not the end, because Floyd Lloyd was still playing it with them, and occasionally they do shows together, but there's obviously only room for one frontman in a show, especially when the fee might not be that high. So I know that the band, because obviously Laurel Aitken was a fairly well-known ska name, he basically ended up by being their lead singer. And that's it. And I'm not sure what happened then. I think they eventually broke up. Or maybe they just drifted apart. And I think that's what happened to the Potato Five.
All right, who's next?
And the next band we're going to talk about is Salvation Sunday. They were one of our favourite bands at the Cricketers. They were like an indie band, but they were like an intelligent indie band. I like them, and I know that Rebecca, who worked for me, helping me to book the band, she liked them, so they did appear at the Cricketers quite a lot. people outside of the cricketers like them too, because Polydor signed them up, I think, for, was it £250,000 advance, which in those days was quite a lot to sign a band up. As I say, there were literally hundreds and hundreds of really good bands. In retrospect, it was definitely the time to start a record label. I did start one a bit later on, but that's another story, and that ended in total disaster, even though I had a manufacturing and distribution deal with EMI Records. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about here, is it? So we're talking about Salvation and Dundee. They were female-led. I think the two main members of the band were related in some way. They certainly had the same surname. They were a really good band. They put a few singles out that never did anything. They were one of these bands that everybody thought they were going to be on the edge of making it huge. I can remember the Melody Maker, they were included in this feature about the bands most likely to make it, I think in 1986. Everybody thought they were going to be huge. And I tell you as well, at the Cricketers, because we were quite close to the centre of town, we were right by the Oval Cricket Ground. I remember Kid Jensen came to watch them. David Kid Jensen came to watch them one night. And he brought somebody, I can't remember who it was. And we had people like that. And there were quite a few people occasionally turned up who were wearing hats and dark glasses and that sort of thing. And so you think, who's that? Is that Jarvis Cocker? Is that? So anyway, Jarvis Cocker then wouldn't even have been famous, so it wouldn't have been him. But it would be somebody like that. Last but not least, we're going to talk about the Untouchables. No, not the Los Angeles ska band, who are very good, I must admit. In the 1980s, I don't know if you know this, I worked a lot with Wilko Johnson. I was his agent for a while and we went on tours of Ireland and places like that. And so we had quite a close relationship back then. It soured later, which I explain in another video. But at the time we were quite friendly and he was quite keen on a band called the Untouchables, and in fact he produced their first single, A-side and B-side, which sounds remarkably like Wilko Johnson was playing lead guitar, but he's not apparently. The band were from Bristol. There's a guy called Jerry Tremaine, who I still know now. He was a photographer and he also played the harmonica. I can remember him playing with Wilko in various bands, and he had this band from Bristol called the Untouchables, and they played at the Cricketers a few times and they were really good. I'm not sure what happened to them. It's one of those things, there were, as I keep saying, there were so many bands back then, so many great bands, that you were spoilt for choice. So if one vanished off the scene, you were almost relieved because there were so many really good bands that you could call on to replace them. Well, thanks for watching. That's all there is really, and I love that you stayed to the end, and thank you very much. Don't forget to join in with the comments and be part of our community. See you next time. And the AI, well, no, I say this might be the best video for you to watch next. Thank you again. Goodbye.